I'm with Henrique Vieira in Brazil. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for sparing the time. Henrique, what is the impact of COVID-19 where you are? We've heard very harrowing stories of what's going on in Brazil, but how are things with you?
Eu me sinto vivendo dia de cada vez.
Personally, I've got a wide range of feelings. Sometimes I feel hopeless and sad. If I sometimes feel more confident, it's because I'm proud of the responses that our communities come up with. So there's a wide variety of feeling there, you know. It's just feelings come and go. In a more general way, I'm obviously disturbed about the world situation, and especially having to deal with the epidemic. But sometimes it can be hard to think, you know, about the levels of inequality and the ways different people have to respond to this. It's actually, that can be appalling, really. So I'm using the churches and the collective movements that I'm part of as a way to develop responses, and also as a way to feel more hope, if I can, about what can be done in terms of responding to the pandemic and more broadly, the extreme inequality of the situation.
Henrique, you talk about the collective response, the response of the church. What is the church actually doing to respond to COVID-19?
Não existe uma resposta.
Firstly, there's not a single vision or a single position about this. Let me give you some detail of this situation, outlining 3 ways that different churches in Brazil are responding. Firstly, there's the extremist response. So religious extremists, you have churches in denial, which take the government line. And they're telling people that just because of the fact that you believe in God, everything will work out for you. And the pandemic or the COVID-19 won't infect you because of your faith. So there's this denial among fundamentalists and extremists, which leads to an irresponsible position from these churches, which are working on minimizing the problem, falsifying the problem, and saying faith provides immunity to COVID. And broadly, there are 2 other responses from the churches. Some are emphasizing that science is to be respected and that science is to be understood as something that's relevant and useful for society. And interpreting reality through science is something that also has been granted by God. So there's no contradiction between faith and science offers a possibility for humanity to get out of a hole. So those churches are trying to minimize the effects of COVID, both social and economic. And I was, in terms of the brutal situation some people face more broadly, many of these sort of churches are working to build networks of solidarity to help family members who are starving and precarious. Essentially working on a sort of stream of support and giving comfort to these families that have suffered the most. And there's a 3rd type of church response, which I would call radical. Besides doing supportive work, they're also positioning themselves publicly and politically against the current government's actions. They're opening up safe spaces for shelter from the epidemic and helping people to find alternatives to the broader economic crisis. But as I said, some churches have also developed a critique of the Bolsonaro government, taking a political position. So denial is an extremist position with regards to COVID, but these churches have been publicly in favor of social isolation, and they've been advocating for more public policies that can help those lagging further behind. So that's my response. There's not just one church view of this.
So they understand that community is changing, and as a result of the pandemic, there's a real desire for physicality, a yearning to get together again. So I suppose the question is not just is community changing, but is it changing for the long term?
Tão contrário ao próprio sentido de vida em comunidade.
I'll tell you what I want to happen, not what I think will happen. I believe we need to cultivate more collective and supportive values as society as a whole. And that's one thing the pandemic ended up teaching us. I'm not saying it's a positive thing, but rather something that it's a learning process for everyone. Now, the current model, liberal capitalism, is really unsustainable. The way neoliberal capitalism is shaping our society. Those left out of the economic model itself, it impacts on their very existence. We must adjust our relationships, the way we relate to communities, the way we relate to our faith and to our religious belief. So this is an historic moment. Capitalism in the way it's shaped right now is emptying out a sense of collectiveness and the sense of society and community. So it's individualistic, it's privatizing the meaning of life. It's an emptying out of the public space as a space for dialogue, emptying out of politics, the space where contradictions are healthy and where people develop fresh views and ideas. There's one image that characterizes what I'm talking about, which is the image of, I'd say, crowded shopping malls and emptied public squares. This is a very strong image. During the pandemic in Brazil, they opened up the shopping malls, and then you could see that people could only realize their existence through buying and acquiring in a place where it's really crowded. It's their only form of entertainment. So my hope is the communities we deal with will be able to respond to some model of socialization through understanding the collective aspects of this fight, and that they're able to build a model of society more based on solidarity, socioeconomic justice, and cooperation. I hope more of a sense of the collective develops. And I go to my church to meet people like I relate with, and I'm going to meet the people I like. So there's obviously an interrelational dimension to this, but I'm hoping that communities can go beyond and build also a sense of response to this model of society that we're currently at. I think it's possible that communities are able to propose alternatives for human sociability beyond this neoliberal capitalist society. Before the pandemic, the world was already sick. That's not to question the severity of the pandemic itself. So if we're not learning through this pandemic about the patriarchal, racist, colonial society that we're living in, a society that does not allow people to breathe, look at what happened to George Floyd in the US, I can't really see a way out. But I do believe in communities and societies as being capable of making this political transition into a new world, and that this can change. And they're really capable of changing to this new model. As long as we understand that our responses as individuals are part of a community, a collective community itself.
Henrique, one final question. I noticed behind you is a book cover with the photograph of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who lived at a time of great transformation in the United States, the civil rights movement, the overcoming of racism. So I wonder why he's there. What does he say to you? Is he somebody you look up to, and why?
Yes, I raised the matter of race only briefly as one of the different oppressions that neoliberal capitalism is anchored in. But to focus more on the racism issue, it goes way back before the neoliberal capitalist era. It was part of the colonial project, and it was actually developed throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, way before capitalism. And it's deeply correlated with the European colonies, and at the same time, we can also identify racism as part of a sort of political sociology. There are four things we have to understand now to come to grips with racism as a process. The first is the economic issue, the second, the political, the third, the ideological, and the fourth is the justice system. I've been reading the work of C.V. Almeida, a Brazilian law specialist who's currently a visiting professor at Duke's. He talks about the objective conditions that make certain non-white people permanently subjugated because of economic policies that reinforce the power of some races and leave people of colour further behind. And it's linked up with politics because it keeps people of colour and indigenous people out of positions of power in the public or the private sectors. The racist considers the European and Anglo-Saxon culture as superior, and everything that is apart from that is not within that product category, is not worthy of attention. And in Brazil, for example, we witnessed the mass incarceration of the black population, the selectivity of the criminal justice system, the broader inequality and access to opportunities and beyond, the lack of black and indigenous representation in places of power. So these conditions mean that some people cannot access rights and are even left sometimes to die. Racism is so entrenched in Brazilian society that the state doesn't even try to hide it. And racism is so widely spread that it has become like a force of nature. It's so common, it happens so often. It's reproduced everywhere you look. It's become the norm. It's like a perfect crime because you don't actually need to kill for racist motives, because racism kills people all the time in Brazil. So yes, the ideas of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and the blues singers from the US, that's something that absolutely relates to Brazilian society at the moment. And there's no possibility of debating and of recreating our democracy without fighting. And there's a structural element which is racist.
Henrique, thank you very much indeed.